Hello everyone. I can see there's about 24 people in this meeting. I presume there'll be a few more filtering in as I just do this introduction. Today is the third LSA Collective Peer Development LSA CPD talk that we've hosted so far. And today we have Dr. Jan Kattein, or founding director of Jan Kattein Architects, who will be exploring how the role of the architect has changed fundamentally during the last decade with technological progress and environmental changes introducing new design parameters. Where does this leave the architect's accountability to communities and to future generations? Dr. Kattein will be presenting a series of case studies that reveal how his studio's design process creates a more inclusive and engaging places that respond creatively to the idiosyncrasies of a local neighbourhood and the people that live there. Just a few words on the format for those of you this is the first time. This is a 1 hour session. However, the talk is 30 minutes, and the whole point of these CPDs that the LSA is starting is to try and give a discussion and questions from the audience equal billing to the presentation itself. So there's going to be 30 minutes talk roughly. There's no pressure, Jan, to stick strictly to that, and then a 30-minute kind of talk. And if you want to put those questions in the chat, I'll read them out. Or if you want to say, you're more than welcome to say, can I speak? And I'll unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and start the camera. And we can have a discussion there as well. In fact, if possible, I would arguably encourage that. And so I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Jan, who's going to share his screen and maybe introduce himself a bit more.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks very much for inviting me to this event, which I think is really great, because I think as architects, we are much too little support each other, and it's really great to be part of this series. And thanks everybody for attending. I look forward to spending the next hour with you. I'm going to see whether I can share my screen. And then we can get started. Full screen, great. So Jason's already said, I set up Jan Kattein Architects about 16 years ago now. And I have been a member of the LSA practice network ever since the school was set up, really, and I'm really proud of that. And I'm also a lecturer at Bartlett School of Architecture too. As a practice, we consider our work as making a spatial as well as a civic contribution. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I will initially start running through a series of case studies, which we'll then sort of use to draw out of it working methods and approaches to practice that we employ as a practice. And obviously really happy if after half an hour people wanted to dig deeper and get some more behind the scenes information out of me too. So what's been really significant for us from the very beginning is this quote from Jane Jacobs, that the idea that cities are for everybody and provide for everybody. And clearly as architects, we've got a responsibility to our clients, but the work that we do inadvertently impacts on everybody at all, who lives near, who works near, who shops near, who feels connected psychologically to a place as well. And the firm belief for us is that as an architect, you need to consider all of these people as clients in one way or another. And each of the projects we're going to run through in one way or the other picks this up, this quote from Jane Jacobs, this idea that a city is made together and not alone. One of the places where our approach finds particular resonance is the high street. I'm going to start with high streets because really that's the place where we started as a practice to become really interested in working with communities and establishing sort of processes and procedures for bottom-up regeneration projects. So a short selection of high street projects I want to talk about. Why are high streets important? London has 600 of them. The UK as a whole, 5,410 high streets, 3,811 station roads, and 2,702 main streets. That's well over 10,000 of these key civic spaces. And it's interesting how the high street's got a sort of psychological meaning as well as is also a physical place. Whenever we talk about the well-being of the nation, the high street surely will be in the headlines in the press. High streets are no longer primarily about shopping, and actually they've never really been. They're key civic spaces which have got a wide-ranging social, economic, and cultural function. Retail is actually nowadays only a really small portion of what happens on high streets. So high streets are important for people to feel at home, to feel belonging, and to provide opportunities that are cultural, that are social, or that are economic too. A significant number of jobs in London is immediately linked to high streets, in particular in outer London, where over half of all the jobs are linked to high streets. You may know this project, High Road Leighton. This was in 2010 that we started work on this, and Waltham Forest Council made a really courageous move at the time and said, well, we've got a recession, so we've got to invest, and we've got to invest in our high streets because thousands and thousands of people in the borough are depending on it. You may have seen this picture too, or maybe these. But what lots of people don't know is really what's behind. And these are the clients that we work with when we work on a high street project. A lot of them have built up their whole economic existence from scratch, whose family is dependent on the businesses that they're running. And sometimes where generations have passed on a business from person to person. And so it comes, there's a lot of meaning in the work, hence, and the relationships that you need to build. In the High Road in Leighton, we worked on 43 properties, and we worked with over 100 stakeholders, business owners, building owners, their brothers, their uncles, their grandmothers, their nephews, anybody who potentially have a say in these spaces. Since Leighton, we've completed another 28 high street regeneration projects, and every one of them has turned out quite different. And every time we've had to look at the context again to come up with a strategy that responded specifically to the need and the aspirations of the communities there. This is in Croydon, and we established a way of sort of, when you work on high streets or when you do very visible, publicly funded public projects, immediately as an architect, you become accountable. You're being put out there. We were questioned in ward forums by stakeholders, by residents, by neighbours, but by anybody working there. And why are you spending money here and not there? What's the impact going to be? So the primary mind shift that happened to me and to us when we started doing this high street work is that every decision that we need to make has got to have a good reason that people will understand, because there's never enough money to fix all the problems. So we need to be able to respond back and report back to anybody querying where we're spending their tax money. And this is what these drawings were about. They were about prioritizing and scoring every single business on a big high street in Croydon to ascertain where our investment or public investment could have the greatest benefit for everybody on the high street. And then there are the much smaller stories. Here, this is down in Nunhead, where we did work which was funded by the GLA. And this is a really nice story of a father and a son. The father has had his motor spares shop on the high street for decades, really. And then his son started in business and he started to do dog grooming. His dad didn't really think that that was a proper profession to have, but he conceded and gave his son half of his shop. So this very unusual branding came up, and the dad was really quite suspicious about us painting it pink, but the son liked it. He felt that it would appeal to his customers, and so we went ahead with it. It was interesting when I came back to site about 6 months after completing the works to do a defects inspection. And the old man was painting the counter pink. And I said, "What are you doing? You weren't so sure about the pink at all." And he said, "No, you know what? My son is being really successful in business, and I'm thinking of moving in with him and scrapping the motor spares shop." So this is just to illustrate the story that there is a depth behind the facade that we work on in these high street projects. Here, this project was about supporting the nighttime economy in Worcester Park, where all the money we got from the GLA we put into neon lighting. And it's really sweet. The local people started talking about this corner as the little Times Square. And suddenly businesses that had been struggling were able to properly advertise that they were open at night. Here in Morden, really key gateway into the town centre, which is subject to a massive regeneration project shortly forthcoming. But heritage is also a really important part of identity, and this project was about refurbishing this wonderful 1930s building and bring back a little bit of the glory of the suburbs that certainly has inspired the design of this when this was originally done. And going deeper, part of the Morden project, thinking about, well, you know, how can we bring new uses and new audiences to the high street? And we took over an old bank chambers that had been vacated and turned that into a creative event and exhibition space, and started to attract different sorts of audience down to the high street. This is Aberfeldy Street. This is just finished. And what's important here is also the idea that the high street after the pandemic has taken on a very different significance for local people again, in that it becomes the sort of public living room in a way, because you can't meet inside anymore, and you rely inadvertently on the local sort of support networks and supply networks that are right on your doorstep. And Aberfeldy Street had a lot of closed down shops to begin with. Really rather drab outlook of the street. People felt unsafe at night, and we proceeded with a three-tiered approach here, getting new businesses into some of the empty shops, working with local people to reconnect them to their urban environment. And this is very much where all these patterns have come from, because we collect them from local people who donated scraps of samples and patterns that we then processed and were applied to the facades. And thirdly, establishing the high street as a sort of event space. And we ran a series of events that promote the high street. And Aberfeldy Street is a really different place than it was only about a year ago. Sayre Street's also interesting, very unusual commission here. Landlease had built one half of a high street and realized that on the other half of the high street, there'd be a building site for the next few years. And that really the businesses on the one side of the high street, which had been very carefully curated and invited to set up a shop there, wouldn't really be successful if they would face a hoarding on the other side of the high street. So Landlease asked us to design and build half a high street. And that's what this is. There are some business units in there, but it's much more about promoting the high street as a space of discovery, of events, of immersive experiences, and of local identity and specificity, where design plays a really important role too. There's another picture of it too. Another thing that we're getting increasingly involved with is workspace design. Workspaces are really critical because they make areas diverse. They provide opportunities, obviously, for small businesses to establish themselves and ultimately to take on a much bigger significance in shaping the urban environment that we're in. And you may all know this project here. It's in Wood Green, Blue House Yard it's called. It's a project on a council car park just behind the town hall. And here it is with people in it. And the initial commission here was just to provide workspace in the blue building and on the yard in the background. But really, there was an opportunity here to do much more than that. there was an opportunity here to create a really key sort of civic space in the centre of Wood Green to provide opportunities not just for any businesses, but for really special businesses that were doing something innovative and unusual. This gentleman makes bags only from UK sourced and reclaimed materials. And as part of moving into Blue House Yard and benefiting from lower rents, he's really been able to establish his business with quite an unusual and novel business plan. And then the building process. This wasn't just about finishing a project and putting it out there. This was about using the process of building and design as a means of engagement and learning. So the project was largely built by volunteers. We set up a contracting organization ourselves so that we could do that. And as a result of working with volunteers, we gave people insight in building processes and transferred some meaningful skills to people too. And the deal was, you work with us for a weekend day, you get given lunch, and you get teamed up in a small team with craftsmen or craftswomen who've got a real set of skills that you can learn. And there's our apprentices on site. We had 8 apprentices from the local construction college who did that practical training with us. Switchboard Studios, another workspace project. And the way this is significant is that it's got wider regeneration ambitions. The idea is, in this industrial estate, if we bring in businesses that are wanting to grow, then they'll have a positive effect on the rest of the industrial estate and on the outlook that businesses have on their own business practice and their future business plan. This is one of the studios there. And then final workspace project, Ebury Edge, which is just finished in Westminster. And what's really great about this is it's part of an estate regeneration project where residents have balloted for the redevelopment of their estate. But the condition that was set amongst everybody was that some of the benefits that the redevelopment would bring would become real and were delivered even in advance of the development taking place. And this is what's happened here. Westminster Council said, no, rather than providing a community space and business spaces when we're done, we'll do that first before we even start demolishing what's on site. So that's what we've got. We've got a retail parade that will keep the street alive. We've got subsidized workspaces. We've got a community hall, and we've got a cafe, which is this space, which is run by a great charity called Fat Macy's, who train rough sleepers in catering skills and baristry so that they can find permanent jobs afterwards. Obviously, public spaces are a really important part of the city, and we increasingly become involved in public spaces, but they're very different sorts of public spaces quite often. This is the Skip Garden in King's Cross, and this was an educational project, which when I was teaching a unit at Bartlett with Julia King, we decided with the students to team up with a charity who was resident in King's Cross, working with communities there, and to actually do a real project on site. And what was really great is that traditionally architectural education is about individual excellence. What the opportunity was here is to convey this idea that no, in order for an architect to realize your project, you've got to work as a team. And this is really what's happening here with people being on site and students learning from professionals who were giving their time voluntarily. That's Rachel on the right, and on this diagram you can see the relationships that Rachel has had to establish as an architecture student to realize her project, which very much was bigger than life. And that's what I really think is very core to what the LSA is doing, is it's establishing these relationships that students aren't just delivering their own excellent project, but that they have, that they realize that part of being an architect is working as a team. The Skip Garden has been demolished now, but what's so great is that with every iteration, the Skip Garden's been in King's Cross really for the last 10, 11 years now. With every iteration of it, there is a new opportunity for people to get involved in recreating it. And this is a vision that we set out for a site behind the British Library. And there really the idea was to, it came about to develop what we call a common plan, a sort of staged development framework that the charity could take forward bit by bit, involving different people who would give their creativity and time and use this as a learning opportunity on site. And we delivered really rather little in the beginning. And that sometimes is what really unlocks opportunities for others. We delivered a kitchen and a warm workspace, a little office. We delivered a toilet block and a potting shed. And we also delivered what's not on this slideshow, a little workshop that CSM took on, a digital workshop for their students to become established outside of the campus in the real world. And we delivered the milk float, which the idea was that it would provide an opportunity for the charity to provide outreach work into Somers Town, which is one of the most deprived areas in central London. And here it is on site taking part in a local festival up in Camden. And one side of it provides cooking facilities so that cooking events can take place. And the other side of the milk float's been converted into a work shed to have gardening tools in it, which can also come out when gardening activities and planting happens in the estates around Somers Town. And interestingly, our project really only started when we left site and when that basic infrastructure was put in place. This is a summer school that's being run that is building outside seating on the Skip Garden the summer after we moved off site. And here is the community allotments that volunteers set up. And the condition there was that the charity set is if you want an allotment, you can't have one on your own because we can't get enough allotments on the site. But if you team up with 2 neighbours, we'll give you one. And it was a really great way, in particular in the context of the sort of problems with loneliness that are increasingly prevalent amongst, in particular, elderly people. Another project down in Thamesmead, which is learning from this idea of the common plan. And here Peabody wrote us a really innovative brief in a way. They said, we're not telling you what to do, but we have a set budget and we have a site. And the only condition is that whatever you do on that site and with that budget is being developed with the community. So we started the project off with a tea party. We hadn't drawn anything. We'd put a mat on the table, provided some doilies and some tea and biscuits. And we talked to people on the way home from school on Claridge Way about what their aspirations were for their neighbourhood. We ran workshops, some of them digital. And this was really great because it got all sorts of people involved. We worked with schools and made models. And ultimately what came out of the project is that the school garden was finished. And sorry, this isn't planted up. We had a slight clash with the pandemic. So the schools couldn't really take ownership of this quite as quickly as we were hoping, but in spring it'll be planted up. So out of that project came a school garden, a series of creative exercises and play benches that are scattered throughout public spaces. An ecological adventure walk in the forest. And one of the other things that residents really wanted was to have a closer relationship with their neighbours. So if any of you know Thamesmead, a lot of the gardens at the rear have got solid close boarded fences. So we installed gates in them and provided planters. And what's happened now is that people meet at the back of their property and that there are planting activities happening together with neighbours. Then final project which I wanted to show is the Wandsworth Food Bus, which we worked with a charity called Feeding Britain, who whose remit it is to run food banks, but they realised the sort of stigma that's often attached to going to a food bank, and that it really wasn't perceived as a positive space by a lot of people, but rather as a sort of last resort space. So we clubbed together and thought about, well, how can we make asking for help a positive and convivial experience that people feel empowers them rather than puts them down. So this idea of the food bus came about, and we initially worked with Feeding Britain to put together a funding application which got funding from the GLA, and here's the food bus. It's just been finished. It's just about to take to the roads of South London, the food deserts of Wandsworth and Lambeth, areas where people don't have access easily to fresh produce, in particular people who are mobility impaired, haven't got a chance of getting to a proper supermarket. They might get to a corner shop, but those sorts of places don't always provide the sort of fresh produce that you need to stay healthy. And the food bus will do just that. It brings food at reduced cost, that's fresh, that's surplus from supermarkets often, direct to people's doorstep, and turns the whole experience of going to get food help into something that's about also spending time together, exchange, and a sort of common concern. There's a kitchen on the ground floor, you can see on the right top. So we've got proper running water, we've got hot and cold, we've got a cooker, and extract hood and things, and there'll be a community chef who'll serve up very simple meals. And upstairs is a seating area, which will also be used for teaching about health and well-being and cookery. And on the bottom is the supermarket area with real refrigeration cabinets. This is all solar powered, and a sort of fruit and produce area at the rear too. And all the food will be available at about 70% of market costs. And it's a local charity that runs this called Being Enriched. So it was Feeding Britain's idea, and Being Enriched is the local operator who's going to run this. And the great thing about this is that this is a prototype, and there are already plans to run these out across the nation, really, as a sort of concept of turning around the stigma that's associated to food banks. I'm going to leave you with this as the last slide. This came out of a community planning event, and just sort of wanted to put forward the idea that as an architect, sometimes it's just as important to do less rather than to do more, but to do the right things, because then there's space for others to take ownership and to take the things forward that you've set into motion. I think I'm about half an hour into the talk, so just slightly early, but I'll leave it there, and it'd be really great to have a more open conversation in the next half an hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Jan. That was wonderful. I've thought of loads of questions, but if any of you have any questions, put them in the chat and I can read them out. Or if you want to just say, you know, I'd like to raise my hand or unmute yourself, then that's also just as fine. But I think I'll kick off by saying, like, I really like how what you do gives communities this kind of sense of ownership and strong sense of belonging. Like, there's a really tangible connection to place. I think that results from the projects that you've done. But what I wanted to ask was how those projects, particularly some of the early ones, how have they fared over time? How are they kind of doing now?
Some of them have changed quite a lot. And actually, when that happens, that's probably very good, because that means people have taken ownership over them. I mean, Leighton is one of the early ones of that scale. And it's interesting that actually some of our work has slightly dilapidated by now, because people aren't keeping up to the maintenance regimes that one might hope. But when you look at the town centre as a whole, its whole status has changed. Leighton used to have lots of empty shops,
Mhm.
And as a result of the works, well, there haven't been empty shops there for years, despite actually increasing challenges associated with the high street. So sometimes it's not really your work that, it's more the sort of, your work acts as a catalyst for other things to happen.
I was about to use the term
That
catalyst,
certainly
yeah.
has happened there. I mean, in King's Cross, there is a nice story around the Skip Garden. The Skip Garden was demolished recently because works are continuing. The last phases of the King's Cross master plan are being implemented. But what's happened in parallel to that, and that's maybe less known, is, well, first of all, we've got the new site behind the British Library, which is much bigger, which hundreds of people have contributed to doing. But the other thing that's happened is that actually the developer in King's Cross have given Global Generation, the charity in King's Cross, a permanent site. And the charity themselves have said that they're convinced that part of the reason that that's happened is because of the support and enabling work that we've done with the students in really asserting what they can contribute. So that new site, it's called the Triangle site, got planning last January. It won't, they're lease, well, in peppercorn rent lease negotiations, but that site will be given over at a 999-year lease in January. And then we're going to go into detailed design and build them a permanent garden there. So there are stories that aren't maybe immediately related to the very work you did, but actually the consequences, the wider and longer consequences of the work, and the things that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't done the work.
Yeah, I see. Thank you, by the way. We've got a question from Aaron, who's an LSA student. It's a great question. She says, thanks so much for the amazing lecture. Can you expand on the funding and economic models, especially when you are working with charities? What is the process of working with charities and small businesses to move them to different spaces?
Well, it's different in each case. As a company, we have decided to give away a certain amount of the time that we spend at the early project stages to charities at very reduced rates, so at 50% reduction, which costs us a bit, but it helps. And sometimes we also do work for free too, to get things started, because we're aware that there are charities or community organizations that simply don't have the funds to hire an architect. And that then helps them to unlock funding elsewhere. So we take on an enabling role, vastly reduced, but we are a small company ourselves. So, there's so much we can do. We pay everybody who works for us a living London wage as an absolute minimum. Well, actually more industry averages really. But that means, yes, we need to sometimes invest in the beginning of a project to get it kicked off, to secure funding, and then ultimately to move forward. There's a few conditions that we set, because it's very easy if you do work for free that actually it isn't embraced for what it is in the full way. So we set a few conditions. We tell any charities that approach us that they've got to have board or director level support for the project, that they pay a proportion, a vastly reduced proportion of our fees, so the work isn't free, but they have to pay a bit for it, and that ultimately they put their own time and effort into the project too. And the food bus came off that way. We did some enabling work with Feeding Britain for very little fee to get the funding application in, which then was granted, and then we could take the project forward. With Global Generation, same thing. We invest our own time. We've got a reduced rates agreement with them on enabling work, and then we can secure funding that way and take projects forward. The high street projects are often publicly funded.
Yeah.
So local authorities appreciate and see the wider benefit that these projects have for the local economy and jobs creation and all sorts of things. So We are paid fees for those, as any other architect is, and we have to, because they are a lot of work. Talking to that many stakeholders involves a lot of time investment. So I don't know whether that fully answers the question, but that there are three examples of how three of these projects have been realized.
Sure, thank you for that. And if you have a follow-up, Aaron, do type that in. Sam has a question, and he asks, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you could talk more about how your practice reach consensus through consultation, particularly where work can be controversial or dividing opinion.
It's interesting. We often get brought in when there are sensitivities, political sensitivities around projects, to help think about how to reframe the conversation. One of the things that I think a lot of people still do wrong, and we are sometimes being asked to work like that, and I just always reject that, is that if design work is far advanced by the time that you consult about it, you really probably missed a key opportunity to get people's trust, because communities aren't stupid. That they'll know that decisions have already been made, if they have already been made, and that actually their input is really limited. So there's one ground rule that we have, and that we realize wherever we can, is don't draw anything until you've talked to people and listened to people too. And that doesn't mean that communities get the say in absolutely everything. This also means telling communities if they don't have a say, but being honest about that, or in which bits of a project they don't have a say. Clearly, when you do housing, there's other standards you've got to work to, and you've got to deliver, to solve the housing crisis. But going out there and saying, well, look, we've got to get 500 units on this site, but we're also considering this as an opportunity to unlock investment for the public realm, and to refurbish your own houses, and to improve cycle infrastructure locally, and public spaces. And suddenly the conversation is a very different one. So that's one of the ground rules, is don't draw before you've spoken and listened to people. The other ground rule is that if somebody purports to represent the community, they probably aren't. This has almost always been the case in the past, that people who purport to represent others in the community are often the ones, not always, this isn't quite fair, I don't want to make this a universal thing, but quite often they are the people who speak loudest and have the most time on their hands, rather than the ones that are actually best at listening. So we make a real effort, rather than going specifically to people who purport to be representatives, to go to individuals, to hear the quieter voices as well as the louder voices. And then we go away and we digest everything we've heard, and we try and come to a measured response. That's tricky sometimes.
I can imagine,
opinions are diverse, but that's part of what we need to do. And then also we need to be honest to the people who haven't fully achieved what their ambitions or vision were, and you go back to them and say, look, we've listened to you, we know you've said this, but in the bigger spiel of the thing, that this can't be realized for the following reasons. So remaining accountable is really important, is also being prepared to say no, and explain why. So that's another thing that's really important. The other thing is, there's a lot of talk about sort of direct democracy and things like that. Actually, we've got a democratic accountable structure in place already with councillors and local authorities. And sometimes that's overlooked. And it's very helpful to tap into those existing democratic structures when you work, and to get councillors on board and say, look, what do your constituents say? What, because councillors are genuinely representative because they're elected and they are accountable in that sense. So, grassroots community things are great, but local democracy is even better. So that's another another recourse that we have to shape opinion and make decisions that are fair and are representative.
So within that conversation with the council, do you end up essentially making a business, not promoting, but making a business case to them about what could potentially happen beyond what they're presented, or the scope of work?
A business case, well, a brief, maybe it's a business case, maybe it's a brief, and being honest about the impact that any designs have, but also the benefits that they bring, and being honest to the client and say, well, look, if your design only has impact and doesn't bring benefits, you're not going to sell this. And actually it's going to cost you more because you won't get planning permission. So this goes both ways. We're of course, we're fully accountable also to our clients, and we have to be, but we're also, we feel within that accountability lies being brutally honest to them too, and to say, building 30 stories here is just not going to wash. And, it's you're wasting your time if you want us to draw all of this up. So it works both ways. It works, listening and saying no also to stakeholders, but also to clients, and being gutsy and risking your job for it. But it's even a greater risk if you don't realize their ambitions after they've spent tens of thousands of pounds on your fees.
Yeah. I'm interested, particularly from my perspective, at the very early stages of community consultation. You mentioned that you're a small practice. How do you kind of have the resources to engage what you say is like 100 stakeholders? And kind of what are the really early questions you're asking at that stage as well?
Well, it's different everywhere. Sometimes we have existing partners that already are very well rooted in their environment, like Global Generation in King's Cross. Well, they're really well rooted in the community. They had 10,000 visitors every year before the Skip Garden was torn down. So we didn't have to go and knock on people's doors or do any leafleting or any of that. They could convene people for us to talk to and engage with and involve in workshops on and things like that. So we try and embrace existing networks, existing distribution lists, like councillors' ward forums are really great, and their Facebook groups and things like that. So using existing networks is powerful and is really helpful. Sometimes we're very conventional and we just stand on a street corner with some posters and some models, and we look at people and they, people come and talk to us, and that's great, that works. When we involve business and building owners, yes, we often go door knocking, and we go and say hello. The council wants to invest in your area, and we'd really like to talk to you about that and what the opportunities might be for your business here. So it really depends, and doing an engagement plan at the outset of every project is critical and important. If we're working for a school, we recently finished a school library, and part of the first engagement activities was to get 400 children to be given homework to build a model of their dream library, and that ultimately informed our brief. So writing up and devising an engagement strategy that's meaningful, creative, and also salient in terms of the sort of conversation that you want to have is a big and important starting point. The questions that you ask are never, what do you think about this drawing, really, or this design, because we won't have a design at that stage. They're about what are your visions for the future? How do you feel that you are associated with this site? How's your business doing? What are you selling? Who are your customers? And just by sort of asking these questions and being prepared to listen, you learn a lot about the area that you work in. which can inform subsequent conversations as well. So the other thing that's really important is to always talk to people twice or 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
So we often go very much in the beginning to listen. And then after then designs take shape, we go back and say, well, look, you said this and we thought this. And what do you think we got it right? Or did we not? And then being prepared to take that back for final iteration. So that's the other thing. You build a dialogue over several sessions in order for people to also feel listened to and taken seriously. The other thing that's really important is not to subcontract consultation. You know, it's got to be the designers that consult and that use design as a method for consultation, which is what we often and increasingly do. We do workshops that are about designing together, which then set up some ground rules and establish the briefs for the designs that we take from there. So that's another ground rule. We always, and it's, even though I've got all hands full as a director of the company, I attend consultations wherever I can, and it makes a real difference.
Mm-hmm. Will we see you in the street corner of the side? Anyway, we've got a question from Imogen, who can unmute herself, I think.
Hello.
Hello, Imogen. Lovely to see you.
Hi, Jan. Thank you so much. A pleasure as always to just hear more insights on, you know, how you're working and what's going through that amazing mind of yours. Yeah, I think I've got like a couple of questions. I'm really trying to narrow them down. But I think my first one initially is kind of, you know, extending from actually what you've just been saying more, which is about, I guess in a sense, the kind of personal qualities of us as designers doing this kind of work, in that process of building trust with people, dealing with, you know, often kind of quite sensitive sort of, you know, personal and social issues. And I wondered whether, you know, do you feel, you know, in all your time of doing this kind of work, do you feel like there's been an internal change in who you are as well? And then just my second one was just generally about the whole gentrification thing and sort of whether you had thoughts there.
Yeah. Well, they're both really important questions. Let me think about what to say about the first one. Well, I think yes, I mean, I think this is very much a two-way process. You know, the reason we do this work is also quite egocentric sometimes, because I'm really interested in people and you know, I really enjoy human interactions in that way, but also because I sort of see my remit as an architect not to just be a professional who makes decisions on behalf of others and puts something in front of their nose, but to convey, and maybe that's, I mean, I still have a role as a teacher at university, which I really revel and enjoy, and there is a level, you know, where clearly we're dealing with lots of lay people who don't know about development and architecture and design and building half as much as we do, and to be able and have the opportunity to convey some of my thinking to people in those conversations is really rewarding. So yes, I find it very rewarding to work like that, because it's both sided, and you do get a lot back. I mean, the project we did together in Hoxton is a case in point. It was just really great to work with all those school children on making all those models, and they really went for it. They really understood what and got passionate about this. And you know, the great story is in Thornhill, as well as in the Thamesmead project, where we worked with school children quite a lot. Quite a few of them said, "Oh, I want to become an architect now." So you know, that's I think that's where it's gratifying, and where you know where it's brought about a sort of personal appreciation of the process. So gentrification, I think, is a really difficult subject. I think it clearly, if you make an area better, there's a risk that the market forces disadvantage as a result, because the area becomes more attractive generally, that the market forces disadvantage or sideline some of the people that have called that area their own to begin with. So yeah, I'm very concerned about gentrification, but I don't think, and that's what's often done, is that regeneration and gentrification are being cast with the same, thrown in the same pot. I don't think one is necessarily the consequence of the other, or one necessarily resulting from the other. At the basis of what I understand regeneration is to bring about spatial transformation that has civic and social and economic benefits, and that's ultimately must be good, because that includes inclusive. I suppose the word inclusive is important to put out there, because when just leaving, it's really scary actually when you read the press of how UNICEF has had to step in to feed children in England for the first time ever in the last couple of days. And I think that's actually really shocking. But if there were more economic opportunities where these children live, and if there were learning opportunities for their parents potentially, then maybe that need weren't as great. And so I think at basis, regeneration has got a really positive ambition. But yes, there is always a danger for it to result in gentrification. And that's a danger that, as an architect, is very difficult to manage. But I don't think that we should, that the learning from that can be do nothing, because it can't be. That people going hungry. There are nearly 1 million people as a result of the COVID crisis becoming unemployed. So the consequence, so gentrification is a risk, but it shouldn't put us off from bringing about regeneration, because doing nothing isn't an option in my mind.
Yeah. Thanks, Jan.
And thank you, Imogen, for the question, by the way. I've got a few more, which we've got time for, I think. I want to use the example of the Blue House Yard, but I think this pertains to many of your projects. How did you identify the opportunity there to kind of do more? Like, is there a specific process in place in your practice to look for opportunity in a certain way, or is that something that exists or not?
Well, we look for opportunity beyond making physical changes on every one of our projects.
Yeah. And
maybe that's, well, I mean, that most people who work at Jan Kattein Architects have been here for many years, so they all know that that's what we do and what we want to do, and what we feel is our remit as architects is, yes, to bring physical changes, physical betterment, but also to bring civic benefits. And we all spot those, and we spot those together. We have project reviews like any other practice would have, but rather than just looking at the physical consequences and the functional aspects or the aesthetic aspects of a design, we look at, what can we do here to ensure that people feel ownership over the project, that people have got learning benefits from the project, that the project is environmentally sustainable, in particular in the context of Meanwhile. That's really, really important, because if we design for short lifespans, we can't end up with a heap of rubbish at the end of it. So we all make a communal effort to spot opportunities apart from spatial opportunities in each of our projects. And probably intellectually I lead that process, but others have got a real important role to play in that as well. A lot of us are academically active as well as working in the practice. So there's 4 of us now have part-time teaching roles apart from practicing. So questioning what we do and how we do it is really important to all of us.
Awesome. Thank you. I've got another question from Mark Vidal, and they say, thank you for your presentation. Further to one of the first questions, on these difficult times when COVID doesn't allow us to meet face to face, have you got any tips of how to engage?
This has been a real challenge for us in the last few months. It has been a real challenge. Some of our engagement activities have moved online, which does actually work where you have pre-existing relationships. It's very difficult to strike up new relationships online, where you've worked with people before to get them to join you online, and where there is an existing understanding that works, we can almost seamlessly continue. Where we have to strike up new opportunity, new dialogue and new relationships, it's very difficult, and it does often rely still on physical meeting, but with strict social distancing, only outside, and a lot more time investment on our behalf. So where in the past we might have spoken to 10, 12 people at a time, now we have to manage that process very, very carefully, and we can speak to 1 or 2 people at a time at a distance, being very careful. So we did a consultation for Westminster in Church Street a little while ago. Well, they have the regeneration hub, but we consciously made the decision we're not going to go in there. We're going to be outside. We're going to bring twice as much staff as we would have normally done. We're all going to be at a distance, and we're going to be there twice as long as we would have normally been there, so that we can make sure that people are safe and we can keep the distances that we need to keep. But face-to-face contact can't be entirely replaced. It's really important, and it's become much more time-consuming than it's been in the past. The other strategy, I suppose there's one more strategy, which is to work with other trusted partners. So when we work with schools, in the past, we would have gone into schools and ran workshops ourselves. Now, we prepare material for teachers, and we teach teachers to teach school children about what we'd like to talk to them about. And that actually works very well too. It's not as gratifying for us. It's really nice to have those individual conversations, but it's gratifying for the teachers because they get involved in something else that aside from delivering that regular curriculum, and actually in conveying what we do, teachers are probably better trained than we are. So that there are ways around, but I don't think personal contact can be totally written off. We've just got to find, some ways of not having personal contact, and other ways in which to have personal contact, which mitigates the risk that that comes with that.
Thank you. I can see we're just kind of running towards the end of this, so there's no more questions. I have one more, if that's all right, and it's how do you ensure that the architecture that you produce or that results on this from your approach? Are there any processes in place to ensure that your architecture does reflect your approach and the consultation you've had with the community?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is that we do a lot of work at the briefing stage. The architecture that then responds to that is often, is very well informed by that briefing stage. A lot of people that we work with recognize that, they care very much about their neighborhood, but that actually, once we've established that trusting relationship, they do trust us with the architecture, which is nice, and we don't try and abuse that trust. So the way that buildings end up looking and end up occupying a site and things like that, they accept, and the way they function and the way the detail works, they accept that most people accept that we probably are better placed in making those decisions, as long as those decisions are genuinely and fully informed by their input. And also people realize when you explain to them that compromises have to be made, that their planning processes, that their building regulations, that their budgetary constraints, and all of these things. So I think actually, if anything, our design is sometimes less compromised than more conventional approaches, where design is prepared first and then from that moment on, when you do the first consultation, it's often compromised to accommodate everybody's view. We try and work the other way, and actually, take genuinely account of people's visions, concerns, views, ambitions, and then use that as a design brief, which means that once you've done that, then the design can live in its full glory without having to be compromised from the moment on that it suddenly comes out into the public domain.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And that kind of, I don't know if you timed that perfectly, but it is now bang on too. So I think we'll draw things to a close. I want to just highlight one quote which you said, which I thought was beautiful. You mentioned, how can we make asking for help a positive and convivial experience? I just thought that was a lovely quote. I just wanted to remind just people of that. And so on that note, I'll thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Jan, of course, as well, for your inspiring talk as well. I wish everyone a happy new year and a festive period.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, LSA. And thanks everybody for listening in. And yes, happy Christmas and a safe new year.
Thank you. Bye-bye.